This video was brought to you by Brilliant. On Tuesday evening, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz announced that the IDF had begun a military campaign in southern Syria to, quote, pacify the region, stating that Israel wouldn't allow southern Syria to become southern Lebanon. This comes just 48 hours after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu demanded that southern Syria be, quote, demilitarised, apparently to protect the local Druze community. And this went down about as well as you'd expect with the new Syrian government, who rejected Netanyahu's proposal as an unacceptable infraction of Syrian sovereignty, paving the way for the escalation we saw on Tuesday. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the history of Israel-Syria relations, this latest escalation, and what might happen next. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So, let's start with a bit of context. Since the Six-Day War in 1967, where Israel effectively defeated a coalition of Arab states, Israel has occupied the Golan Heights in Syria. Israeli forces captured the Golan Heights in the final days of the war, largely because they considered it strategically valuable territory. During the war, Syrian forces had used the area to shell Israeli villages in the Hula Valley below, and Israel argued that not occupying the territory would leave it vulnerable to future artillery attacks. To understand this, you sort of need to see a topographic map of the area. The Golan Heights are sort of an elevated plateau, sitting above the Sea of Galilee. To the north of the Golan Heights is Mount Hermon, which is basically the last mountain in the anti-Lebanon mountain range, which sits about 40 kilometers southwest of the Syrian capital of Damascus. Anyway, Israel held on to the Golan Heights until the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Syria launched a surprise attack on the territory, coinciding with Egypt's assault on the Sinai Peninsula. While Syrian forces originally made good progress, Israel successfully counterattacked and ended up with more of the Golan Heights than they had in 1967. As part of a UN-brokered ceasefire to the Yom Kippur War, Israel signed the 1947 Agreement on Disengagement, which required Israel to withdraw and create a small buffer zone between the Israeli-occupied bit of the Golan Heights and the rest of Syria. But this buffer zone is pretty tiny, less than a kilometre wide in places, and is occupied by a UN-led peacekeeping force known as UNDOF. In 1981, Israel unilaterally annexed the Golan Heights, claiming it as Israeli territory, although this claim has only been recognised by the US, and is widely considered to be a violation of international law. Anyway, this has been sort of the status quo for the past 50 years. Israel has de facto controlled the Golan Heights, and the UN has administered a thin buffer zone between there and the rest of Syria. However, after Assad's regime fell in December, Israel launched a series of airstrikes across Syria, which basically destroyed every aircraft and naval vessel in the country, and Israeli troops advanced into the UN buffer zone and onto Mount Hermon, with the Israeli government arguing that the 1974 agreement had been voided by the collapse of the Syrian government, although we should say that the UN does disagree with this. This is sort of how things stayed for the past couple of months. Israel was illegally occupying Mount Hermon and other Syrian territory, but Syria's own government wasn't really in a position to do anything about it. Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, actually made an active effort to assuage Israel's concerns. You might expect a former al-Qaeda jihadist, whose nom de guerre literally refers to the Golan Heights, to be furiously anti-Israel, but Sharaa's rhetoric has been conspicuously measured, and he's insisted that Syria would abide by the 1974 agreement and that Iran-backed groups like Hezbollah would no longer be allowed to operate in the country. Unfortunately for Sharaa though, his efforts to assuage Israel's security concerns have apparently been insufficient. Over the weekend, Netanyahu gave a speech demanding that Syrian troops withdraw from southern Syria, specifically Quneitra, Daraa and Suwaida, 3 of Syria's 14 provinces, where most of Syria's Druze minority live. Unsurprisingly, Syria's new government rejected Israel's plan. On Tuesday, Sharaa held a long-awaited national dialogue conference with 600 delegates from across Syria, including from Syria's Druze communities. The conference's concluding statement reiterated Syria's territorial unity, decried Israel's incursions in Syria, and specifically rejected the, quote, provocative statements of the Israeli Prime Minister. This apparently didn't go down too well with Israel, who only a few hours later launched airstrikes on targets in southern Syria, as well as ground incursions into a few towns around Mount Hermon, at least according to reports on Wednesday morning. So why is Israel actually doing this? Well, Netanyahu claimed that his plan to demilitarize southern Syria was about protecting the Druze, and promised that Israel would ensure their security. But this doesn't really make sense. There's very little evidence that the Druze actually want this. While certain Druze groups have made overtures towards Israel, the Sweden Military Council, a coalition of Druze groups formed earlier this month, announced a few days ago that they plan to join the national army of the new Syrian state. So if it's not about protecting the Druze minority, then why else? Well, there might be some genuine anxieties in Israel's security establishments about Sharar's jihadist past. After all, he did used to run an al-Qaeda offshoot. But at the same time, A, Sharar has actively tried to avoid upsetting Israel, and B, this government really doesn't look like it's going to be an al-Qaeda-inspired jihadist state. If anything, it looked like it's going to be friendlier to Israel than Assad was. It's therefore at least possible that Netanyahu is trying to destabilize the nascent Syrian state to make it easier for Israel to occupy more Syrian territory. So what happens next? Well, Sharar now faces a difficult dilemma. If he fights back, he risks tumbling into a full-on war with the IDF without a fully formed national army or state. If he just sits back, though, he risks undermining his legitimacy, especially because Israel's actions have already triggered protests across Syria. In this context, he might be tempted to look to Turkey for help. Turkey was Sharar's main backer when he was running the Idlib province, but since taking power, Sharar has tried to distance himself from Ankara to prove to ordinary Syrians that he's not just a Turkish proxy, but an independent Syrian who can reunify the country. Nonetheless, with Israel threatening Syria's territorial integrity, Sharar might decide to lean on Turkey a bit more. This will be a risk for both Sharar, who could end up becoming essentially dependent on Turkey, and for the wider region, given that there'd be a non-zero risk of some sort of direct confrontation between Israel and Turkey. Now, the thing is, often in politics, we need to understand a wide variety of topics to truly grasp what's going on. And fortunately, our sponsor this week, Brilliant, can help us do just that, with thousands of lessons in maths, science, programming, and AI. And not only that, their interactive lessons teach you by doing, instead of just asking you to mindlessly memorize stuff. In turn, this helps to build your critical thinking skills and become a better thinker. For instance, Brilliant's newly updated maths courses help you to establish a strong foundation in algebra. It then helps you to build on this, teaching you how to conquer calculus, all while maintaining an emphasis on problem solving and reasoning. The thing I like most about this, though, is that their mathematical courses help you to develop your mathematical intuition and fluency, skills that you can use in the real world. As we've told you before, data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating the modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. To try everything that Brilliant has to offer for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/TLDR, or click the link in the description. And by doing so, you'll get 20% off an annual premium subscription.